All right, thank you again for finding this video. This is the criminal process part 2. So last time we were taking a look at the last video, we were taking a look at some sort of moribund laws and things like that. We're going to take a look at a few sort of like varieties. So what types of crime we're talking about, and I'll just go through these quickly. I'm assuming you can go back and take a look. So again, we always ask the question, where do these things originate in the Constitution? We could look through, of course, many of you are already familiar with this, Amendments 4 through 8. And what's interesting about those is they kind of go in order of the process, right? So like warrants all the way to punishment in Amendment 8. And also in Amendment 14, the Equal Protection Clause in particular. So severity. So one way of looking at this is in terms of severity, that there are some crimes that are less severe than others. And so in general, these are called misdemeanors. They usually are punished by a fine up to 1 year. And also felony, which are more serious ones, sometimes a year to death. That's life in prison or execution. And so the type and manner are important. There are different kinds of crimes, as you know. There are violent crimes, property crimes, sexual crimes, drug-related, white-collar, organized. There's treason. Treason's the only crime that's defined in the Constitution. It's in Article 3, the Supreme Court Federal Judiciary article. And even that is not an elaborate definition. So a lot of these types of crimes, which have pre-existed the Constitution, but have some of which have emerged in different ways, we can only sort of infer from the Constitution, and that's kind of how it was designed, right? So again, I'll put this under causation simply because we're taking a look at some of the historical views on where crime comes from, and so I had you read a short little work by Charles Loring Brace in 1880 to give us a little snapshot, sort of a view into how people thought of these things about 150 years ago. And in his little work, The Causes of Crime, we see, and again, I'll run through this fairly quickly, assuming that you've read it. Well, one of the things that's important to consider is one of the major factors of the 19th century as it pertains to crime, criminal justice, and law is urbanization, the massive and abrupt rise of an expansion of cities. So think about it for a moment, if you will. You go from a model which was agrarian, where most people that you encountered in your life were people you knew, that lived in your community, lived down the road, fellow farmers, whatever, and then you go to a model where you can go into a large, very densely packed area where there are all sorts of sanitation problems and logistical problems, and you are almost entirely anonymous. So what that says about, interesting social psychology is when you're anonymous, you might be more likely to create a persona that is not who you are. You might be a little bit more tempted to commit crime because you might be able to get away with it because you're not accountable to those people. They're anonymous. They're less, relevant to you, if you will. So Brace is coming from that school. He's noticing this happen in the Industrial Revolution, and it does not look good. He says there's when we look at this sort of population of criminals, and he's largely looking at urban crime. He says these people are coming from another country, so there's an added sort of double anonymity here, not just in an urban area, but also coming from another country. And he says that there's a kind of a bad moral effect. So I don't think he was necessarily against immigration, but he noticed that there are some correlations between immigrants and crime. He said even if they speak English, they are generally ignorant, which on some level was probably somewhat true, right? They just didn't know the ways. They came to America, either it was a push factor or a pull factor. Maybe they had this hope of starting a better life. Maybe they were fleeing persecution, but that doesn't necessarily mean they knew everything about America or how to make it in America. So there's a lot of ignorance. He does relate this sort of social Darwinist view that the lower class is idle, they're prone to abuse, that it's that they don't work hard enough, and so they find crime an easier way to make a living, which is a pretty controversial statement and quite a generalization. He said that the unemployed are more likely to commit crimes, which may or may not have been true, depending on his sample size and who he was talking about. If we continue that, I wanted to show you this image. This is one of a series of images that were scandalous in the late 19th century. So think again, if you will, about what's going on in terms of technology. So photography was still in its, maybe its second generation by this point. And this is an image that was very similar. I believe this is by Jacob Riis, who is a guy who got his name for this kind of photography. He'd go through the tenements of New York City with a public health inspector sometimes, and he would burst open the door of these little tenements, take a scandalous shot like this to, when I say scandal, I mean to sort of expose certain things, to show the public the terrible living conditions of these people. So a lot of these people were living in really horrendous conditions. And his photography, when it was published in a book called How the Other Half Lives, really showed people who don't live like this the need for reform, economic reform and criminal reform. Because if you are living in a tenement where it's 10 people in a room or something like this, squalid conditions, all the more reason why someone might turn to crime to get out of that. Right? That's sort of a presumption that we still have. And again, there might be some truth to that. The unemployed, according to Brace, were more likely to commit crimes. And then what's really interesting here, I don't know how you felt about this, but it's really interesting that he maybe even posits this theory that there's something embedded in these people, almost like he wouldn't use the word genetics, but he called these gemules, that maybe there's even a second generation of criminal. People are born. They're born to other criminals. It's fascinating, right? So he said that one of the antidotes to this is marrying above one's class. It kind of weans that impulse out. It breeds it out of you. This is a term we don't really use anymore. It's called superogamy, where you marry above your class. So again, all sorts of interesting sort of opinions and theories all mashed in together. So it's this idea of the dangerous class related to racial profiling, or was it progressive, right? Because there might be some element to this. We might not call it a genetic element, but it's a cultural element, a culture of crime in which someone learns crime from their family or from their elders. Interesting. We might. What's interesting about this is there have been a few studies that have challenged the idea that it's just culture that makes criminals. Even very recently, that there might be some individuals who are more prone to, for example, violent crime. They're less likely to be able to control their emotions, and there's something physiological or neurological about that, not just cultural. But interesting, this debate continues. So again, in 1906, the largest annual influx of immigration occurred, this high watermark or low watermark, depending on how you want to look at it, which exacerbated Brace's concerns. And of course, one of the ways of dealing with that was the Americanization policy. And so we get to something which is really pretty notorious. It's something that maybe you criminal justice majors have come across in your Principles of Criminal Justice courses. It's a regrettable part of our history, but it was, again, seen at the time as a very progressive, very scientific way of looking at this. And in a sense, this is related to the discrimination, some of the discrimination issues we were looking at in a previous unit. This is called anthropometry. It's a field of criminal justice that doesn't exist anymore, based on eugenics, the science of racial capacities. And so what you see here are some kinds of profiles that this new and emerging science of criminal justice would have used to predict what kind of suspects to look for certain types of crime. Because what was embedded in that, as you probably already know, was this presumption that certain people are physically bred in certain ways so that their brains make them more likely to commit certain crimes. And you see what's really slippery about that is the racial component to this. People from Eastern Europe, it just so happened in an age of a lot of Eastern European immigration, seemed to fit a lot of these stereotypes. They tended to have lower brows, bigger noses. They looked a little bit more like, and forgive me for this, but this is the thinking, more like animals or apes. And so because they had swarthy complexions, they had dark curly hair, low brows, and they acted suspiciously, then they were profiled. And some of that might have been self-fulfilling prophecy as well. So this led to tons of cycles of profiling and complications in criminal justice. All right. So another side to this is really interesting. Another sort of strangely progressive thing is going back to John Locke yet again. One of the things that John Locke is well known for among this class is his political writings. But he was also really influential in the late 1600s, early 1700s for writing one of the first modern psychology textbooks. It's really interesting. And in those books, woven in with his political philosophy, is this idea that all predispositions and worldviews are largely created by cultural conditioning. So we're a product of our culture. That it's the social situations that help create us. We're not born with all these ideas and all these good and bad things. We are created after birth to develop into certain people, and that applies to crime and punishment as well. So we get to another. Maybe you've studied Beccaria as well, but way back in the Enlightenment in the 1760s. Beccaria was writing, an Italian writer who influenced a lot of the framers of the Constitution. In this famous essay on crimes and punishments, he says very famously, and this is totally ahead of his time. I mean, no one was really saying this except some of these Enlightenment thinkers. He said, "It is better to prevent crimes than to punish them. If you want to take care of society, prevent the crimes, and there are ways of doing that." Enlightenment means a rational, autonomous, self-interested man. We assume that these people are born criminals, but actually what Beccaria and Locke are saying is that they're made to be criminals because of social circumstances. And I think our society has sort of caught up with this idea, or at least embraced it. There's still the nature-nurture idea going on there. But for those of you who are going to go out on the job and become cops, and you're going to be running down people and investigating, maybe in the back of your head will always be the thought, is this person just a bad egg? Or are they the victim of social conditions? Or maybe you'll be conflicted, as many of us are. So Beccaria was very much against the death penalty for a number of reasons, and he said that really we need to look at penal reforms. He influenced Jefferson and among others. He said, ultimately, in the spirit of enlightenment, law should be clear and simple and rational, things that we can all apprehend. They shouldn't be too complicated, because that would be unnecessarily penalizing people for the complications of law, which is unfair. And above all, a law should be fair. Enlightenment, he says famously, should always accompany freedom and liberty. Let me see if there's one more here. Nope, I think that's it. Okay, so we're going to pause there, and I'll see you at the next video. Thank you.